So it's another Tuesday night. We're marching through March right now, where today is March the 7th, 2023. This is session 23. And I remember when we started, it's been 14 months now, just about. And the first session that Zach attended, he said, this is January of 2022. He said, how long are you going to go for on these sessions? Probably going to end it by May. And I thought at the time, well, it may be a little longer than that. But here we are 14 months later, still in Matthew. And I'm trying to go in order through the New Testament. Of course, the good thing is we're covering so much in Matthew, especially here in Matthew 24, that Mark and Luke will basically be the same thing, won't be much new material at all. Gospel of John. So we'll kind of go through those quickly. Acts, Romans. So a lot of books may just be one lesson. But there are some key chapters that we'll camp out in. Some like 2 Thessalonians 2, when we get there, that'll be very interesting to go through in detail. But the handout, and for those of you watching or listening to this later, this is another one of those sessions that it really is important for you to have the handout in front of you. So as I notify everybody by email, I will remind them to print out the attached document so they can follow along, because it's a little confusing if you don't have this document. But this is kind of the third session of looking at key chapters on eschatology and key books and putting them side by side using 7 main points that they all share. And so I've never attempted to do this before quite this way. And so we had a session just on Matthew 24 and 2 Thessalonians 2. Then we added last session, the book of Daniel. And then tonight we're adding the book of Revelation. So we're going to be spending most of our time in Revelation tonight. But these are the 2 primary chapters and 2 primary books in the whole Bible that speak about eschatology. So we're just trying to show, as I put way up in the heading, I call it shared truth in Daniel, Matthew 24, 2 Thessalonians 2, and Revelation. So then I make the observation, Daniel, Jesus, Paul, and John all agree with each other. Surprise, surprise. And they use common terminology, common phrasing, words, key words. And at the very bottom, concluding by saying a perfect example of the wonderful unity of the Bible. They borrowed from each other, and they were all guided by the same spirit of truth. So this is just a way to take large chunks of eschatology by these 7 different items listed in the first column, 7 different sub-subjects of eschatology, and showing how they are used in each of these 4. And so tonight, looking in Revelation, and it's also important to use the whiteboard tonight. And by point 1 and point 2, I'm talking about point 1 and point 2 on that 4th column under Revelation. Some added information that I didn't have room to put because of narrow columns like this. But we'll start with the subject in the first column, the coming of Christ. So we've looked at how it's described in Daniel, Matthew 24, 2 Thessalonians 2. And the opening, one of the opening verses in Revelation 1:7 is a really, really important verse regarding the whole subject of the coming of Christ. It says, behold, he is coming with clouds, and every eye will see him. So there's no indication of this being a secret private kind of coming, like the pre-tribulation rapture teaches. But this is a very open, visible, literal coming. And it says, even they who pierced him. Now that is a quote from Zechariah 12:10. And it says that they shall look on him whom they pierced, and they shall weep. And that's talking about ethnic Israel, Jews, who will be alive at his return. They'll actually be able to, as he showed Thomas after his resurrection, see, here are the wounds in my hands, my feet, in my side. You're welcome to come touch them if you want. And Thomas said, no, I don't need to. It's obvious. You are the Lord. Well, what is it going to be like when 2/3 of Israel, Jews, maybe even around the world, but at least in Israel, have been killed? Only 1/3 of them left. They're hiding out there in the wilderness, protected by God. But they're not in belief yet. Maybe some of them as individuals are. Or maybe some from the church saints will be preaching to them and helping them and so forth. But by and large, they are still in unbelief. So they are out there in the wilderness, but they don't know, they don't understand, because of their unbelief, that they may not survive. They may be killed like the rest of their people have been. So, they don't have assurance and confidence of their survival out there, unless there are some like us able to tell them, you are under God's protective hand, you're going to make it, you're going to be safe. But whether they believe that or not, the evidence would not point toward their survival in their unbelief. So what will that moment be like when they look on him whom they pierced? Now, those people out there in the wilderness didn't kill him. It was their ancestors. But in their unbelief, they identify and agree with what their ancestors did. So it can be said about them, they shall look on him whom they pierced, and they shall weep. And I don't think we understand the depth of that weeping, of how brokenhearted they will be. So when he says, even they who pierced him, that's a quote from Zechariah 12:10. But also all the tribes of the earth, well, that may be the tribes of Israel specifically, but it may be speaking about Gentiles as well, all those on the earth. The tribes of the earth will mourn because of him, even so, amen. Now, this is also quoted, Zechariah 12:10 is quoted in John 19:37 at his crucifixion. So the Jews are looking at him on the cross, and it quotes Zechariah 12:10, they shall look on him whom they pierced. But we know that's not the fulfillment of it, because they didn't weep in repentance at that point. They had cried out, crucify him, crucify him. So yeah, they looked on him whom they pierced, but it was not a repentant looking, a faith looking. But at his return, it will be fulfilled spiritually, and they will be saved. Now, what I wanted to point out on point 1 is that this word coming here in 1:7 is not parousia. We've been talking about parousia, or you'll hear people say parousia, which is probably the more correct way to say it. But I say parousia. We've been talking about it a lot. It means presence. It means arrival. But there's another Greek word for coming that's actually more common. It's the word erchomai. And in Matthew 24, erchomai is used 8 times, parousia 4 times. So erchomai twice as much. And I give 2 verses that kind of shows the difference. And parousia is a noun. One way to understand the difference, a noun versus a verb. So erchomai is the action of coming. It's the whole thing. It's the start to the finish. You're going from one place to another. So it's an action idea. It's a verb. But then the end result of erkomai is parousia. I have arrived. I'm present. So even both of them are translated coming. Parousia is the event at the end of erkomai. So that's an easy way to understand it. It may not be that important to you, but there are some who like to go into the details of these things. Certainly some who will watch it later or listen would like to open up their Greek study books and look into it further. But erkomai is, so parousia is presence. Erkomai is the process. So we might say, I might tell my wife, Gary's coming over to our house. Well, that would be erkomai. He's not there. He's got to get in his car, drive, and so forth. That's erkomai. But when I look out and see his car pull up and he's getting out of his car, that's parousia. He has arrived. His presence is there. So it's kind of an interesting thing to know the difference. And the reason I bring this up from Revelation 1:7, our first verse, in that fourth column, is what's interesting to me, parousia, which is the more, would you say, important, powerful word, because this is actual presence. So that's the one we focus on most regarding his coming. Parousia is used how many times in the book of Revelation? 0. And you'd think it'd be all over that book, because his presence is all over the book. But the word parousia is not used, not even one time in the book of Revelation. So I thought that was kind of interesting.
Which word's not used?
Parousia is not used one time in the book of Revelation, even though that's the word we usually grab hold of when we're talking about the coming of Christ. But certainly erkomai is, like you hear in 1:7. But the idea of his presence is parousia is all through the book. It's kind of like the book of Esther. We say it's the only book in the Bible that doesn't mention God by name, but God's all the way through the book, obviously. And so the presence of Christ is all through the book of Revelation, but the word parousia is not used. So I wanted to show a little bit more about the difference between these two. Parousia is presence. Erkomai is the process. It's the verb idea. So I referred to two verses in Revelation, 1:6-16, where they say, hide us from the face of him. So he's still in heaven. Like Revelation 19:11 says, I saw heaven opened. So I take those two verses literally, that at some point before he actually starts his journey to the earth and arrives, God's going to let people on the earth see him ready to start that journey. And it's going to scare the daylights out of them. And yet the Bible says they still didn't repent. That's how. But by that time, the deception of Satan through Antichrist will have had its complete work, to the point God has sent them strong delusion that they should believe the lie. So by that time, everything's pretty much set. At some point, maybe people can't repent. Their choice has been made and the line has been crossed. But that's right down there at the end of all of that. So heaven is opened in 1911, hide us from the face of him, so they actually see him as he starts his journey. It's unfolding. Erkomai is kind of the unfolding progress of the whole travel. Parousia is when he gets here and his presence is seen on the earth. So I just wanted to kind of point that out. Let's move on to point 2, which is what? Deception from the first column. And we've talked a lot about deception. And if I'm not careful, I'm going to spend too long on this one. But let's go to 13:14 is the verse I give from the handout. And we've already looked at the verses in Daniel, Matthew, and Thessalonians that talk about the deception of Antichrist. But 13:14, he deceives those who dwell on the earth. And I point out over there under point 2, means of deception. Number 1, signs and wonders. Signs and wonders. What are the fastest growing churches in the world? Signs and wonders churches. How is he going to deceive them, this verse says, who dwell on the earth? By those signs, which he was granted to do in the sight of the beast. This is the false prophet now, working with the beast, telling those who dwell on the earth to make an image to the beast who was wounded by the sword and lived. Then I make the point, he's empowered by the greatest deceiver. That's back in 12:9. So the great dragon was cast out, that serpent of old called the devil and Satan, who deceives the whole world. So the greatest deceiver of all will now be incarnated in this man. So this man will have the power of the greatest deceiver of all time, who appears as an angel of light, so that most people don't recognize him, as I have said countless times in my ministry, but it bears saying again, deception is not true deception unless it doesn't appear to be deception. You don't see it as deception if it's good deception. And we are all easily deceived, much more than we recognize. So 12:9, who deceives the whole world, he was cast to the earth, to his man on the earth, and his angels were cast out with him. And then I give some closing verses in chapter 20, which I won't turn to read, 3, 8, and 10, which just kind of says the same thing. The great deceiver, Satan, was bound and for 1,000 years and so forth. But I also wanted to look at a real interesting verse in 18:23. So number 1, the means of deception is signs and wonders. I also wrote 2 Thessalonians 2, 9 to 10. He does power. He does signs, wonders, and power is the working of Satan, Paul says. But 18:23, the light of a lamp shall not shine in you anymore. The voice of bridegroom and bride shall not be heard in you anymore. For your merchants were the great men of the earth. For by your sorcery all the nations were deceived. So the second means of deception, sorcery. Sorcery is plural. And most of you know that Greek word in 18:23 is pharmakia, so the pharmacy, drugs, so forth. Normally when we talk about this idea in Revelation, sorceries, we start talking about, usually every time I've studied this, preached on it or whatever, I go back and I do updated research on the effect of drugs in society. A few years ago I read, I don't know if it's still true, I think it probably is, but there's all kinds of new illegal drugs out there. So I'm not sure if it's still true, but a few years ago I read that legalized drugs have surpassed illegal drugs in addiction. In other words, drugs that are normally prescribed by doctors have a greater amount of addiction than even illegal drugs. I don't know if that's still true, but at least they're fairly even. So, we just normally think of illegal drugs and addicts and how it destroys their lives, and all of that is very deceptive. Who thinks the first time they take a drug thinks they're going to be on the street with no money, in the gutter, living homeless, addicted, completely controlled by this drug? People don't take it the first time thinking that, or they think they can escape it. But prescription drugs, legal drugs, of course, the one problem with that now is that people with legitimate needs, sometimes for very powerful painkillers because they're in extreme pain because of certain surgeries or diseases, doctors are afraid to prescribe it now because doctors got in a lot of trouble. Hospitals got in a lot of trouble for over prescribing. So now they've, what I call the pendulum swing, now it's almost gone too far the other way, where if you legitimately need something, you can't get it because of fear of addiction and so forth. And I put down here this, at the very bottom, a new meaning for all this since COVID. Let me explain that quickly. I've been saying the last couple of years that something happened during COVID that just knocked everything sideways. And part of that has to do with this subject. You know, if you're prone toward taking certain drugs, you're prone toward alcohol or, you know, whatever that, but because of your job and family and responsibilities, you've kind of kept it in check. But if all of a sudden the government says, lock yourself in your home for weeks at a time, don't go anywhere. Well, if you're prone toward that, there's something in human nature that says, I can get high for days. I can stay drunk for days. I'm not going anywhere. No one's going to know it. I'm not going to get in trouble on my job. And so a lot of studies have been done on this, that drug use, alcohol use, greatly increased during COVID. That's understandable. That's kind of easy to know why. Plus, people were losing their jobs. People hated wearing masks. Everyone just seemed kind of sideways anyway through all that process, which then lended itself toward greater use of drugs and alcohol, which greatly increased. Suicide rates went up. But before COVID, the part that I was never able to bring up because it really wasn't as evident is the part of pharmakia that the pharmaceutical companies and the deception, evil, greedy, wicked, terrible deception of collusion between drug companies and governments, telling the world, you take this as quick as you can and you won't have to worry about getting COVID. Okay, well later, people start getting COVID that'd been vaccinated or whatever, even several times with boosters and everything. Okay, well we knew it wouldn't be permanent. We kind of knew you'd have to be taking, but we did it for your own good. The ends justified the means. And by the way, you're going to have to keep taking booster shots probably once or twice a year, maybe for the rest of your life. And state and national governments probably aren't going to be paying for it anymore. So your insurance company are out of your pocket. But you got to do it. And then you look at the bazillions of dollars profit that they made this last year or two. And now many of them are freely admitting, yeah, we deceived you, but it was for your good. Now, just put that whole process on steroids, and they're pretty much already telling us that larger and worse pandemics are going to happen in the near future. And your only hope is we'll come up with another drug. You're going to have to start taking it. My only point in all this is not to really rag on the pharmaceutical companies so much as to show how powerful companies and powerful governments can collude together to deceive the masses and scare them to the point they're willing to do anything for fear of their life. And if something bigger and worse comes along, and it will, it just shows how the deception can be so overwhelming when the greatest deceiver of all, Satan, enters his man who is already deceiving people, and he becomes the greatest deceiver who ever lived as a person, how he's going to be able to take control. Fear is a great motivator. Fear is a great deceiver. So that added part has been kind of interesting to me of the use of legal drugs to deceive the masses. And as I say, a condition worse than what we went through is going to come along, and the same thing's going to happen, just on a larger scale. And, we're being told, as I more and more am saying, I've spent all my life trying not to be conspiracy theorist. Trying to stay away from it if I can, because it can just take you anywhere and everywhere if you let it kind of overwhelm you or control you. But now I kind of changed to say everything's a conspiracy. Everything is a conspiracy. They're lying about everything. They are deceiving about everything. What are we finding out now about the January 6th, what they call it? Insurrection. And then they finally get all of the tapes that were not given to the public, and now we're starting to see these tapes of people just peacefully walking around. And there was always some troublemakers involved in a crowd like that. But the government wanted you to believe everybody was acting that way, and these tapes are showing, maybe 1% was acting up. 99%, they were like waving flags, taking pictures, walking around. It's the Capitol building. Police were giving tours, let people in. And they're calling it the worst insurrection since the Civil War. It's all a big lie. And that committee that had all those hearings on that, trying to put people in prison, they knew they were telling lies. They had all the information. They knew it, and they still lied to us. Well, I wanted to give a political talk tonight, but just multiply that by 10 or 20 times that big and powerful and deceptive. And that's what the Antichrist will have his hands on. And that's why he says he deceives the whole world. And it's going to be the greatest deception of all time. Anyway, point 3, let's move on. Apostasy. I do have a little different view than most people do in this idea of apostasy. Often it is said you got to be in the truth before you can fall away from the truth. I understand that. I agree with it in principle. But there are general truths that you can reject that still makes you, the word apostasy just means rebellion or revolt or being a rebel. And you can be a rebel against the U.S. government and really never having agreed with anything about the U.S. government, or very little, and still rebel against it. You're just opposed to it. And so, to me, in this point 3 of column 4, I refer to 13:6 of Revelation, and it says, "Then he opened his mouth in blasphemy against God, to blaspheme his name, his tabernacle, and those who dwell in heaven." In other words, anything remotely connected to the idea of a God in heaven, a true God, a Messiah who died for us, any of that, any connection to that on any level is rejected by this man. And so he's the greatest rebel who ever lived. And I think he and his attitude and defiance against God is part of what the apostasy means. So just be careful about defining it so narrowly that it means, well, it has to be someone in the truth and then falling away from the truth. And part of the reason we press that so much is 2 Thessalonians 2 uses those words for apostasia, the falling away. So we say, well, you got to be in it before you can fall away from it. But apostasia can have a more general meaning of just a rebellion, a revolt, a defiance against truth. And that's what 13:6 is describing, is he's rebelling against the truth of the Creator God, of the God in heaven, of the Savior that he sent. Everything about that, he's rebelling against it. 2 Thessalonians 2:4 says that he exalts himself and opposes everything about God, so that he sits as God in the temple of God, showing himself that he is God. Now, if that's not the most accurate description of rebellion against truth, but then it does lead to, so I call him the greatest rebel, open defiance, and it causes 13:8, all who dwell on the earth will worship him, whose names have not been written in the book of life of the Lamb slain from the foundation of the world. And it will include others. It will, his revolt against God in the abomination of desolation in the middle of the 7 years will cause multitudes to follow his path. And some of those will be falling away from the truth that they once proclaimed. And therefore, that falling away from what you once believed can fit in there. But I think the actual great rebellion is what this defiant man, when he blasphemes God in the temple of God, showing himself that he is God, is just that. To the point that he causes in verse 16, all, both small and great, rich and poor, free and slave, to receive a mark on their right hand or on their foreheads. So the great rebel causes mass rebellion. But it's his rebellion that's the greatest example of that, I guess I would say. The abomination of desolation, point 4, in the way it's brought out in Revelation, is in 13:6. We just read it. So he commits blasphemy against God, his name, his tabernacle, his dwelling place. It's called in other places his temple. And I think part of what this is, 13:15, the false prophet was granted power to give breath to the image of the beast, that the image of the beast should both speak and cause as many as would not worship the image of the beast to be killed. Oh, there's a lot I'd like to say about that, but I'm just not. Tonight's not the time. But the reason I quoted 13:15, this image, is, remember, then I say compare Daniel 11:31. The reason I refer back to that, it says they shall place there the abomination of desolation. I went over this a little bit last week, but if you look at this point 4 in Matthew 24 and 2 Thessalonians 2, it uses the word standing and sits. So that's the person. The Antichrist goes into the temple of God, declaring himself to be God. So as a person, he goes in, but also this false prophet causes this image of the beast to speak and to, I think that's what Daniel 11:31 is saying. They shall place there the abomination of desolation. So I say it's a person and a thing. The abomination of desolation is the Antichrist going into the temple, declaring himself to be God. And then I think that's the same place that the false prophet sets the image up. because it's placed there. That's the thing. The temple, point 5, I refer to the same verse, 13:6, it's called his tabernacle. In 11:1 and 2 of Revelation, and this is a disputed passage, but I'll just say this in passing. 11:1 and 2, I was given a reed like a measuring rod, and the angel stood saying, rise and measure the temple of God, the altar, and those who worship there. But leave out the court which is outside the temple. Do not measure it, for it has been given to the Gentiles, and they will tread the holy city underfoot for 42 months. It's really common for people to say this temple that he's talking about here is symbolic, it's spiritual, it's not the literal temple in Jerusalem. And I guess the only thing I'd say about that is if, at the end of verse 2, if the holy city is literal Jerusalem, and most everyone agrees that it is, then the temple is a literal temple. Why make the temple something symbolic, but the holy city something literal? It either has to be both one way or the other, I would think. So there's the temple, and 13:6 calls it his tabernacle. So both terms from the Old Testament, tabernacle and temple, his two dwelling places. Point 6, the gathering of saints. So we looked at all those in the other three places. So let's go over to where it is in Revelation. So sometimes the question is asked, where is the rapture or resurrection, the gathering of saints to Christ, like Matthew 24, 2 Thessalonians 2, even Daniel 12, so clearly, describe? Where is it in Revelation? Well, if you're pre-tribulation rapture, you have two choices. It's not mentioned in Revelation as one choice, because there is no pre-tribulation rapture described in Revelation. That is the truth. Or you take the position that 4:1, when a voice came from heaven to John, come up hither, that John is a picture of the saints being raptured up into heaven. That's quite a stretch, isn't it? God calling an individual, and we wouldn't even say that John's body was taken up into heaven. Probably he went in spirit form into heaven, saw some things. If you read through Revelation, John seems to be up and down, in heaven, on the earth, in heaven, on the earth, back and forth. Well, if it's a picture of the saints being raptured, then what does it mean when he's up and down, up and down? So that's quite a stretch. So then your other choice is Revelation doesn't mention it, and it does not mention a group resurrection into heaven in a pre-tribulation setting. But it does mention a gathering, a harvest of people toward the end, or at the end, in 14 verses 14 through 16. And I think this is clearly a description of the rapture and resurrection. Then I looked, and behold, a white cloud. So there's the cloud idea. So, a lot of pre-tribulation rapture people will say, well, he's only coming to cloud level. Whenever all the many verses that talks about he's coming on the clouds, means he's only coming to the cloud level, and then he's going back for 7 years before he returns again. One big problem with that is you look at all the cloud verses, and they're clearly in a post-tribulation time setting, like Matthew 24 and 30. He's coming in the clouds, and he's going to send out his angels to gather together. But what is that setting in Matthew 24:30? Immediately after the tribulation, verse 29. So all these cloud verses of Christ coming are, if there is a time factor involved in those verses, it's post-tribulation. So 14:14, Then I looked, and behold, a white cloud, and on the cloud sat one like the Son of Man, having on his head a golden crown, and his hand a sharp sickle. Another angel came out of the temple, crying with a loud voice to him who sat on the cloud, "Thrust in your sickle and reap." By the way, this temple, you read through Revelation, there is a temple in heaven, and the temple on the earth was patterned after that in the Old Testament. So there can be a temple in heaven and a temple on earth, both. So some people read this verse and then they go back to 11:1. They say, see, the temple is symbolic of the temple in heaven. But for a long time, there was one in heaven and there was one on earth. Thrust in your sickle and reap, for the time has come for you to reap, for the harvest of the earth is ripe. So he who sat on the cloud thrust in his sickle to the earth, and the earth was reaped. That's clearly a rapture resurrection description. And it's a positive description. It's a reaping for good, not for evil. How do we know that? Because verses 17 through 20 describes a second reaping unto wrath. So that's the separation of the wheat and the tares. Jesus said, leave them alone until the end of the age. And then he will send his angels and separate the wheat from the tares at the end of the age. So this is just showing what Jesus said in Matthew 13. Separation of the wheat and tares. Verses 14 through 16 is the wheat. Verses 17 through 20 are the tares. Then another angel came out of the temple which is in heaven, he also having a sharp sickle. Another angel came out from the altar who had power over fire. He cried with a loud cry to him who had the sharp sickle, saying, thrust in your sharp sickle and gather the clusters of the vine of the earth, for her grapes are fully ripe. Well, it sounds okay so far. So the angel thrust his sickle into the earth and gathered the vine of the earth and threw it into the great winepress of the wrath of God. So it's definitely not the wheat. That's the chaff that Jesus said shall be burned up with fire. And the winepress was trampled outside the city. Blood came out of the winepress up to the horses' bridles for 1,600 furlongs. That's describing the Battle of Armageddon. So these are clearly two harvests. It's clearly one is good, one is bad. It's down here at the end of the book of Revelation, the end of the 7 years. Some people who take a position of what they call post-tribulation, but pre-wrath. In other words, they have the actual literal wrath of God in a very short, condensed time frame where we are caught up in the clouds with him, and then he pours out the bowls of wrath in very quick succession on the earth. But we don't go back to heaven. We're witnessing all of this with Christ in the clouds, and then he continues his journey to the earth to finish the job where he defeats the armies of the Antichrist. And they'll use this, they'll say, see, the reaping of the wheat is just before the reaping of the tares to go into the wrath of God. And it's a pretty good point. I haven't changed my view to that yet, but they do make some good points. But it's that wrath of God then is made into a very short, concentrated period of time. Maybe lasting just a month or so, a very short time. Okay, the last point, number 7. And we'll read it, but we're all very familiar with it. And I thought of what to say on this one, and all I could think of is what a scene. The 19. This is his, we would call this his erchomai, not his parousia. Because this is, as he's on his way down, they're seeing it in progress. They're seeing it in progress as it unfolds. Heaven is open, hide us from the face of him who sits on the throne. They see him get on that white horse, and they see him starting his journey. And they all know we chose the wrong side. We made the wrong choices. Now I saw heaven opened, and behold, a white horse, and he who sat on him was called Faithful and True, and in righteousness he judges and makes war. I like these kind of verses when it's talking about Christ, because often the misconception is made, is decided upon, and then stated, why is the God of the Old Testament so mean and brutal, and the God of the New Testament, Jesus, is so kind and loving? And then you look at a verse like this, think, well, there's two sides of that coin of God's nature. Paul talks about it. Behold the goodness and severity of God. And so the Old Testament might stress his severity, the New Testament might stress the goodness, but there's plenty of both in both places of the Bible. His eyes were like a flame of fire. See, John's on the earth. He sees heaven open. And you have to use your imagination a little bit here, but we see heaven as someplace so far off that if heaven was open, we couldn't even see into it. You know, it's 1 billion light years away. But heaven is right here. There's the three heavens, you know, and all that kind of stuff. But the air around us is part of heaven. The atmosphere is part of heaven. And don't you think that God could arrange things to where no matter how far off Jesus is when he starts that journey, God is more than capable of making sure that people on the earth can see the details of it? It's not hard for God. It's not. But what we're going to see in the millennial is what Jesus said at the end of the Gospel of John, chapter 1. Angels of God are going to be ascending and descending upon the Son of Man. The separation of heaven and earth is just going to be like not even there. Heaven and earth are going to kind of merge, but they've been kind of merged all along. We just couldn't see the difference in our human bodies. What's really going to happen is God's going to take the scales off of our eyes. We're going to realize there's been angels around us our whole life. We just didn't see them. God has been right there the whole time. I just didn't see him with my eyes. You know, that separation between heaven and earth is going to be removed, or at least recognized for what it's been all along. We just weren't able to distinguish it. His eyes were like a flame of fire. On his head were many crowns. He had a name written that no one knew except himself. He was clothed with a robe dipped in blood. And as we saw from the book of Isaiah recently, why are your garments dyed in red coming from Bozrah, you know, the wilderness? It's the blood of his enemies, not his own blood. His name is called the Word of God. And the armies in heaven, which by the way includes angels, it's not just the saints. Many verses talk about he comes in flaming fire of vengeance with his holy angels. So the earth doesn't have a chance with Christ leading the charge, with glorified bodies, indestructible bodies, a part of his army, and the angels as part of his army. This poor world doesn't stand a chance. Clothed in fine linen, white and clean, followed him on white horses. Out of his mouth goes a sharp sword, that with it he should strike the nations. He himself will rule them with a rod of iron. He himself treads the winepress of the fierceness and wrath of Almighty God. Vengeance time, payback time. And on his robe and on his thigh a name written, King of Kings and Lord of Lords. And it goes on to talk about the, as I've liked to preach through the years, since I love food so much, part of what you're choosing in life is you're choosing which meal to partake of. The marriage supper of the Lamb or as Brother Bill Ames called it one time, the banquet of the buzzards. Then I saw an angel standing in the sun, cried with a loud voice, saying to all the birds that fly in the midst of heaven, come and gather together for the supper of the great God. That's a meal you don't want to be a part of, because you are the meal. That you may eat the flesh of kings, the flesh of captains, the flesh of mighty men, the flesh of horses, those who sit on them, the flesh of all people, free and slave, both small and great. Boy, the birds are going to have quite a feast. And I saw the beasts, the kings of the earth. I wanted to read to get to verse 19. Whatever they're trying to do in the battles leading up to the final battle, when they see heaven open and Christ coming on his white horse with his armies with him, whatever modern weapons we will have at that time, probably Andy might have a better idea of this than any with his military ties, but we probably would be scared to death if we knew what weapons were at our disposal right now that we're just not being told about or aware of. But ever how long in the future this is, weapons will continue to advance, and they'll be pointing all of them at the sky. No longer will they be trying to destroy each other. They will have a common enemy, and they will. This is Satan's. It's kind of like Satan knows the Bible, and even though it's hopeless, because if he knows the Bible, he knows it's hopeless. But he will make one last attempt. He knows if Jesus makes it to the earth, he's doomed. So why not try to stop Jesus from getting to the earth? It's okay if he's up there on his white horse, but somehow when he gets close to the earth, let's throw every weapon we have at him to try to stop him. Maybe it will discourage him enough that he'll turn around and go back. I saw the beast, the kings of the earth, their armies gathered together to make war against him who sat on the horse and against his army. That's one battle I would love to be part of. It's kind of nice being involved in an all-out war when you know you can't be killed. You know you're invincible. Then the beast was captured, with him the false prophet who worked signs in his presence, by which he deceived. So that idea of how did they deceive? The signs and wonders, by which he deceived those who received the mark of the beast, those who worshipped his image. These two were cast alive into the lake of fire, burning with brimstone. Cast alive. I can't even imagine that. The rest were killed with the sword, which proceeded from the mouth of him who sat on the horse, and all the birds were filled with their flesh. And then we start the 1,000 years. What a scene. So I'm going to stop there, and this